Hi, this is Conversations with Sebastian Galliani, episode 64. Our guest today is Fernando Alvarez. Fernando is a distinguished macroeconomist and the Charles F. Gray Distinguished Service Professor in Economics at the University of Chicago. With him, we will talk about the work and legacy of Robert E. Lucas Jr. Bob Lucas was a giant in economics, and he received the Nobel Prize in Economic Science in 1995. Hi, Fernando. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thanks. Thanks for calling.
Great. So, sadly, we learned 2 weeks ago that Robert Lucas passed away. He leaves an immense intellectual legacy, and it's a pleasure for me to talk with you about the work and legacy of Bob Lucas. I read your recent note about Bob in the blog Foco Económico, and your admiration for him reminds me a lot of Borges' admiration for Kipling. Borges used to say about Kipling, very few writers have achieved that level of perfection, and I always trying to learn from him. So could you provide more context about your intellectual relationship with Bob?
Sure, yeah. So on the personal level, okay, so even though it's on the personal level, I think it's basically of everybody that sort of work in my area, which I would say that is macroeconomics sort of broadly conceived. But in my personal level, it was, one thing that stands very clear from reading any paper from Bob is that he writes on a different level of almost everybody in economics. It's really like kind of in a world by its own. So on the conceptual level, I think Bob's kind of unique in terms of going kind of to the main part of a problem and identifying important problems and kind of like, thinking about the problems again from scratch. And I think that that's kind of like a legacy that is it's very clear. And you read his papers now, every single paper from Bob that looks very modern, but you read it in the context of that time. I actually did that. I went back to some of the papers and I browsed the journals in terms of the papers on my area. You just cannot recognize it, that these other papers, written by extremely good economists, were in the same area. It's really like a before and after. Mm-hmm. And also on the personal level, my advisor was a collaborator and a student of Bob, was Ed Prescott. So, and Ed Prescott had also like an unbounded admiration from Bob. Mm-hmm. I could tell you that from first I still remember when a paper by Bob will arrive and Ed reading it. It was kind of like almost a religious experience for Ed. So it was very, and also like something that is amazing. If you go back and you read Ed Prescott Nobel address, he also talked a lot about the contributions from Bob, which, it's a tall order. This is not someone like me talking with someone like you. This is like, someone framing his contributions after receiving the Nobel Prize and basically yet explaining the preeminence of the work by Bob. So it's quite impressive.
Right. Let me actually quote something that you quote in that article in Foco Economic by Ed Prescott. He say about Lucas, right?
Yep.
Particularly noteworthy is Lucas' role in the macroeconomic revolution. In the very late 60s and early 70s, he revolutionized macroeconomics by taking the position that neoclassical economics should be used to study business cycles. Others have dreamed of doing it, but Lucas actually figured out what ways to do it. In his paper, Expectations and the Neutrality of Money, 1972, he creates and analyzes a dynamic stochastic neoclassic model economy that displays the Phillips curve, which is a key equation in the systems of equations of macro models. I can think of no paper in economics as important as this one. So I'd like to ask you if you can sort of illuminate all of us on why this paper is so fundamental in the modern macroeconomics revolution.
Yeah, so I think, and to be fair, also partly this is modesty by Ed. I think that there are sort of two things, related, but in some sense important, separate contributions. One is that if you look at the even earlier work than this, I mean, maybe published in the same year, but previous work by Ed and Bob, which is associated with the creation of rational expectations, true, which is a very important concept, but also is with the idea of using general equilibrium to address topics in macro. Before that, we have our own language in macroeconomics, sort of like, there was never like something like, people making choices, things having to adapt. That was just a foreign language. Then we went to micro. That was sort of studied in micro. That's really a contribution by itself. And, here is more so than in the earlier papers with Ed, because it's addressing a topic, the Phillips curve, which is at the center of macro. So it's kind of the combination. So, but that, I think, that is actually that part, the creation of, going back to general equilibrium and rational expectations itself. Both of them is kind of a joint project with Ed, which both of them got a lot of the attention to thinking it that way from David Cass, which I think is, a very important person and many times not given credit for that. Okay, so but it's really Ed and Ed Prescott and Bob Lucas. Now, then this paper itself, and the papers I'm referring to now, it's kind of like previous papers, are papers that were like about industry equilibrium and also like a model of unemployment. They were totally real in the sense of not really thinking about any monetary phenomenon. Okay, so, but this paper instead, the Lucas 72, it's basically has really addressing a monetary issue. I mean, Bob, one of the, I would say, two topics I had in mind always were like very much macro topics, like, inflation, unemployment, business cycles, and then sort of topics in growth. But this one is really like at the center of kind of some sort of nominal rigidities. So I think that this paper then has this other part that, it deals with, it's the idea of rational expectations. Is the idea of actually finding a rational expectations equilibrium. This is a bit on the technical side, but I think we are in the right place to talk about SHOP. It's what is called a non-revealing rational expectation equilibrium. So a lot of the rational expectation models, what it has, they have the property that by looking at prices you learn anything. And at the center here is think about it, it's the first paper applied to macro. At the same time, it brings the idea of kind of, you get prices, but you can kind of get confused. This is something that now people use in finance all the time. In fact, in a way, way, way less sophisticated and much, much less transparent and nice and bold with the so-called noisy traders. There's no noise traders here. This is just a bonus, but think about it, like, And then it's addressing the issue of nominal rigidities, which is like a key issue. So it's kind of the combination, because it's really like applied to an important question. It's really bringing this to macro, both the use of general equilibrium, dynamics, and really rational expectations, and the creation of this idea of, sort of how you could get different notions of nominal rigidities. But here, the nominal rigidity comes out of information. So it's really a paper that is just so modern. Now we will read it. It will be like, like a very modern paper in macro, but at that time, it was just like, totally revolutionary. Indeed, you think that it was published in JET, which was a new journal at that time. It was rejected, and many of the other journals, and I don't think it's a blemish for the editors. It's like, sort of, it was very, very new. Yeah. So it's kind of like, it's hard to recognize. So.
Yeah.
So anyway, I hope that this is trying to sort of summarize what I think that they were the main contributions.
It's not that uncommon that really influential and novel papers didn't make it to the top 5, basically.
No, and also that they will not be recognized by the importance. For instance, taking away from thinking about other of my idols is like, I guess von Neumann also didn't think very highly about Nash thesis about the Nash equilibrium, even though, it's like another genius, both of them kind of some sort of, people like off the charts, but many times it's just hard to see. Now, here actually is even more revolutionary, I think, given but, von Neumann was very close to obviously game theory, but didn't see, and he's tried all his life later on, all his academic life in doing game theory because of the straitjacket of, zero-sum games.
Well, yeah, and for example, on another level, but Lucas recognized that sort of the implication of the Lucas critique, which were profound, and I will ask you later, were in a paper by Muth before that he published in those volumes with Sargent, and no one was paying attention, and Muth got uninterested because no one was paying attention, and so tracing back all these ways in which the thinking in our profession evolves is really interesting.
Yeah, and it's not, when it's something so, and many people, even the best, I think even Bob, I remember him telling me about, as editor, saying, look, Bob was a very good editor in the sense that I wish, many of us that tried and didn't do a good job of being editors, he will be, kind of very fast. He would put his imprint in the papers, but he would say, look, but you had to accept that you will make mistakes. And he told me the paper saying, look, this paper that now I see they are great papers, I rejected them. It's sort of like, and he told me, and many times you rejected because you don't see that, you're just not able to see that they will be very important. So
Right. So you were saying, and I think there is a consensus on this, that one of the nice things about the Lucas 72 paper is not only its profound methodological contribution, but also its substance, right? So it's really, really an important paper on both. And I think that's characteristic of the work of Bob Lucas, right? It's both substantial and methodological. And I wanted to get some reflection of me and see what you think about this, because what is really striking is he got into economics, right? Because he will study history, and he realized that the most important questions in history were related to economics, which I do agree also. But then once he tried to teach economics himself, he realized that he needed formal mathematical training. That it was not like history, right? It was not enough to read English to go through.
And he didn't get that in grad school. he went to Chicago, but he didn't get anything on grad school. This was sort of self-taught together with Ed Prescott.
Right. But okay, I'm going to go there. But then he got to a point, right, in his career at which he needed himself to expand the tools economics use, and he did it, right, starting from history and not having that training probably in grad school. But what also I read, and I find is consistent with this view that we have that his contributions are substantial and methodological, is that the two big influence, at least at the period he was doing the PhD, were Friedman on the substance and Samuelson through the foundation of economic analysis on the methodology, right? And if you think his work is a really good combination of that substance and that type of methodological work. What do you think about this, and who else do you think kept contributing in his career?
No, I think that you are totally on point. I remember Bob telling me that I think he was still a graduate student when Peter Diamond must have gone to Chicago to present, which I believe was his thesis, which is this fantastic paper related to Samuelson. It's sort of the theory of it's a theory of debt. It's basically a model like Samuelson famous OLG model, but with capital. And then you could talk about over capital accumulation, public debt, a bunch of things. Anyway, so I remember Bob telling me that when he saw Peter Diamond presenting that, It's a paper about like important substantive issues in economics with a simple model, talks about them, but sort of like rigorously, done so you could ask questions in the model that make sense. Then he thought that this is the way to go. But nevertheless, he didn't have access to people kind of teaching that. He was just not in the cards. But he told me that this was in grad school. And, if you look at the first years of his career, still, it wasn't really until, I think, I believe there was the influence of Cass on both him and Ed Prescott. But it's just as you described, because I remember him telling me about that paper and the impact that he made it. Also, Sidrowski. Sort of like, sort of you could see that he's thinking, okay, so I like the way this is the way to approach a question. I just not able to do it. And then, right. Let's just go and get that. So I totally agree with your, at least from all my interactions with Bob from your characterization.
So let me move to the Lucas critique, which I'm really, it's a paper I really like it a lot, and so I come to think that paper is fundamental in shaping the change in the way macroeconomics have changed since the mid-70s, right? In the sense that it's a key motivator for the development of micro foundations. It's kind of saying, well, we cannot really do counterfactual analysis or anything if we don't go back to models that take into account how people form expectation and how they make decisions, right? So Tom Sargent, I maybe you saw it, just published a new working paper about the work
I think I probably showed up in the paper as giving a lot of comments to Tom, so I know
okay.
pretty well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he also emphasized a lot this paper in the same lines, which I felt
it's actually it's a paper by Tom in Carnegie as a celebration. I forgot. I think it's the 40th year of the Lucas critique.
Right.
And Tom is, they could have not chosen someone better to write that paper.
So then the modern macroeconomics that emerge from these developments can be characterized, right, by the development of equilibrium stochastic dynamic models. In a world in which continually buffeted by shocks, the sensible way to think about decision problems is formulating decisions rules or contingency plans for choosing actions which depend upon agents' informations. Then the central theoretical breakthrough of the last 50 years is that economics now think of equilibrium as a rest point in the space of decisions rule. This is technical, but you will clarify all this, okay? So can you help us understand this intuitively for a broader audience? And also, you already touched a bit on this, but if you can be more explicit about how fundamentally different this is from the pre-modern macroeconomic literature.
Yeah, so I mean, this clearly make a very big impact on Tom, as you could see on that. Sort of the idea of that is just to think about, and I would like to make two comments. First, really try to do the best to, maybe give like yet another not as well exposed version of that, but just expand on it. And second, to briefly talked about kind of rational expectations and the relationship with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but first, I mean, the idea is that you're trying to think about a problem in which there will be a policy that will have consequences in the future. So how would you think about that? Well, you need to think about someone kind of making sort of some form of sequential decision-making. And this sequential decision-making, it means that you have to think, you can't really think about rules that are like fixed depending on what future contingencies will occur. I mean, like think about like, what will be, I mean, for the non-technical audience, either will be elections, say in November,
mm-hmm.
Sort of like then, people have to think as of now, what will be, the effect of different policies. You can't
Right.
really think about like if this will not affect you today. So that means that at the decision-making point of view, you need to think about these sort of contingent plans contingent on what will occur. But then all these plans, they need to be consistent with each other. Some notion that, it's that sort of demand is equal to supply. So this sort of this contingency, and now that's just modeling. And on top of that, now we're thinking about a decision maker changing something. Then he has to recognize this effect. So that's the part that is very profound, because the first part is thinking, okay, we're gonna model something that is about dynamics. How should we do it? But the second part is we need to think about a decision maker, affecting changes in the future. Then how should we think about that? And actually the embryo of basically timing consistency is there in that paper.
Right.
And you see that that Tom talks about it in the paper.
Citing Calvo's work.
Yeah, totally. I mean, sort of like Guillermo's paper. It's more or less. It's more or less contemporaneous to Kirtner and Prescott. And in fact, but it's not really there may be some confusion. It's not really the Calvo. Anyway, so Tom uses like a variation of what it will be, kind of like a version of Calvo to expose it. I mean, let me just do a full stop for those maybe not like reading all the papers, but this paper that we're talking about, Tom Sargent, thinking about the Lucas critique, is using a particular model, like a version that has kind of like it sort of sounds a bit like Calvo, and it's using that to actually trace a lot of the ideas of timing consistency and how to think about decision making, in this case, from the point of view of governments, which Bob didn't really have answers to that, but he just started asking the questions, but tracing all the literature that came after that through, being started with the Lucas critique. That's why I think it's a fantastic paper to read, Tom's, just to think about what is the sort of the lineage of all this. So it's a great paper. Tom, obviously, it doesn't really need my endorsement, but nevertheless, I'm offering it. It's a fantastic paper. Oh, sorry. And then I want to say something about rational expectations. Now, rational expectations is the most natural concept to bring here, because you're thinking about, you're thinking about the future, the government thinking about the future, what could be kind of consistent with that. But both Bob and Tom were actually quite open to think about, the boundaries of that. Bob wrote about them. I mean, wrote papers about kind of learning, and Tom is known to have an entire agenda about kind of the, how to think about that. So, but, in some sense, these two things are, not necessarily one goes with each other, because whatever concept you think about how people will form expectations, the point is that you need to take it into account, both how agents will do it and what will be the effect of policymakers.
Exactly. I totally agree with that. I though once you get into the dynamic models, you need to form expectations, right? And the natural thing is first to think about rational expectations. Then you may explore other alternatives, right? And so I think Sargent, I once read an interview to him, and he gave a great example. Again, citing one of the papers of Zidrowski, I think it was discussed by Jorgensen. And Jorgensen says in his comment, it's a 60-something paper, right? Okay, here there are three prices, they are different, where they are not the same, right? One is the expectation. And so it was there, right? It was a natural way to get there. And yeah, indeed, Lucas, I always cite one of his paper, I think it's 86, in an issue in which there is rationality with psychologists. And he say, yeah, of course, I always know that there is, the system has operated for a while, so people can get a way to have this expectation. And it's very important once you move into the real world, because you have countries that are a lot more unstable and are changing all the time, and there it's a lot more difficult.
But I think that while Bob was very open to that, he also, and I think this is well known, also will have very little tolerance for like kind of shallowness, saying, well, because rational expectation is not a good concept for that, then let me do something that is kind of shallow. There's, it's not that you could claim to say, well, look, this is not ideal, then let me do something kind of ridiculous.
Exactly.
So that was something that will not go well, because, there was a whole idea of, well, no, let's just think it through it. I mean, sort of, but he himself was more like into thinking about models of learning. Tom, I think, had also things about learning, but other alternatives, and, but it's kind of like conceptually very open. But at the same time, I would say with good reasons, I think they're kind of like a bit allergic to being just shallow and saying, well, because rational expectation will not be a good concept here, then I'm going to use X. And X is whatever I have in mind on my agenda. So that actually was something will not go well with either of the two.
Well, because methodologically it was at the antipodes of what he wanted to do, right? So it's completely ad hoc.
Claiming the residual type of idea will not.
Right. Okay. So within the framework of the this unified modeling strategy that appeared right after this revolution, you have that we started with some idea of monetary policy not being effective, at least in the medium term, right? But right now that has changed, right? You have all kind of models that have departed from, let's say, perfect competition, which also feature of the original papers in the literature, and in which essentially a lot of focus is given to monetary policy and how to use monetary policy to stabilize business cycle. My sense is that Lucas was not that happy with that development in the literature, and that he consistently believed that there exists a neutrality result when the model is in his way well formulated, and that sort of our understanding of the short-run cyclical variability of the economy remains limited. I think also because of the influence of Friedman, he thought that there was a role for monetary policy, but as a result of monetary collapses, right? Such as those studied by Friedman and Schwartz. And so I wanted to know what you think about this, how the literature evolved, but also if you have the chance to talk to him about this in the context of the 2008-9 financial crisis, because that was the only big shock since the development of this literature, and I think he probably reinforced his view after that.
Yeah, I think that Bob actually. So I talked many times about this and other sort of issues with Bob, but he's kind of on the record on many of these things, just pointing out of several things similar to what you said. So let me say something first. So, he will criticize Ed, for instance, in the view about the Great Depression, on the importance of monetary policy. Both, I think that a lot of people agree about maybe what happened later on with some measures of the Fed, but the question is the entire reason monetary policy, sort of like how bad was sort of deflation? Bob was very much in Friedman camp. Nevertheless, he will be saying, well, it's not that I know exactly how to model it. He will kind of, but he will be very much, and he will write these things against ideas from Ed. I mean, these are like, sort of, this is kind of something kind of well known. He was also, kind of, and the same actually, that he had the same reaction to 2008. And then he was a big supporter because of that of Bernanke. because it's sort of the way he thought about it. I mean, I think he wrote about it, but also, talked many times about this. It's very much like a version of the Great Depression. Okay. He was less into kind of like what in macro people think about, like, kind of interest rate rules, the same as Friedman probably was. But actually kind of like quantitative easing, this type of thing. He thought that this is sort of like, and also I remember, and this I think is in the record, that he will be saying, look, when something like this happens, you don't go to the drawing board. Now you use what you know, and then you tried. Sort of then he was having this idea of what is that the Fed should be doing, and being very positive about sort of Bernanke's type of approach and ideas. So that's kind of very similar to what you said. I think in general also he was, for instance, when he was working, he has this paper with on sticky prices with Mike Golosov. So the idea from that paper early on was to think about Japan and whether kind of like the sort of whether monetary phenomena could be, which Bob thought that is what will, that's why he wrote this type of paper. Now the model didn't work out for that. So they end up kind of using it for something else. But this was as you said, like, something he was thinking, and Japan is like a decade lost. Well, at the time that they were writing the paper. So the paper is published, I think maybe 2007 or so, but, was written before. And at that time, it was clear that there was at least a decade of very, very low growth. So it was even a medium run, both thinking of these things have been important. But it's true that he was less into, like, sort of interest rate rules type of literature. But he was very different from Ed in that, of giving like a, kind of like a critical importance to monetary policy. He thought it was very important. It's just that, that's something very different from Ed. He was also thinking that, wasn't convinced that we are like that how much we understand it. So he was, but it's very clear, and I could give you like, actual quotes on papers in which he writes this. So, and I think that's kind of, a lot of people have the incorrect view by looking at the 72 paper, that what Bob will think is that no, there will be no point of kind of monetary policy. But it was also more like, that there's like a small payout of kind of a small fluctuations being, addressed by monetary policy, but it's a huge payout. I mean, he was always, now, who's not, but he was always a big, fan of Diamond Dybvig, this type of ideas, and thinking of them, of the monetary consequences. So anyway, so he was really, as you said, I mean, he was very much affected by the ideas of Friedman, but methodologically, he couldn't be more different from Friedman.
Right. Let me go back to the note you wrote for Foco Economica. The other thing very important you highlight is that Lucas made also very significant contributions to the literature on economic growth, right? So not only he had huge impact in macro, but also had huge impact in economic growth. So can you sort of tell us a bit about that line of work?
Yeah, I think that his papers on the mechanics, it's a fantastic paper, because it's, I mean, just in terms of also focusing the energy of, kind of what are the important things, and relating these to relatively simple ideas and simple measurements. This is a paper with, like, it's work with different models, and you could see also a lot of his future work coming out of that. Sort of, first of all, it's a model in the tradition of neoclassical economics, very much affected by Uzawa, but also affected by Solow. But sort of like in that paper, he also thinks a lot about externalities and what could be the engines of growth. And you look at his subsequent career. So I think after that, there was like a huge literature on endogenous growth. But Bob was always thinking a lot about externalities and what could have been the sources of growth. And a lot of his subsequent papers, several of his subsequent papers are about that. So I mean, when you look at it in retrospect, you can kind of clearly see the ideas. Also, if you talk to Bob often, this will be like very clear. And so I think that for him was also, and he writes it very clearly, and so, that, you know, this is like an important question. And we can't really think, you know, this also is sort of related to, you know, just thinking about the difference between the income per capita and income through time, and what should be the sources of growth, how this should be kind of, you know, so the first order importance. And again, and if you look at the literature that he has after that in terms of cities and externalities, this is not necessarily, in my opinion, because of his interest in geography, but just because he wanted to think about, I see on cities the evidence of agglomeration and externalities of his literature in transmission of knowledge, the same. It's sort of like he wanted to think about engines of growth, and, you know, so all these things are kind of related, and I think the paper caused like a huge impact. I mean, we are from the generation kind of before and after, you know, in terms of like, we saw how, you know, it sort of changed a lot, the emphasis on talking about these issues.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I remember I was doing like a master at Ditela before the PhD when the paper came out, and we studied that with Guido Porto.
No, I think that I I was doing, I think, my undergraduate, and I think it was Federico Sturzenegger's dad that was teaching it.
No. Okay.
So it was.
No, okay. Then we read it after it came out, because I'm sure I did the master after you did the undergrad.
Yeah. I mean, but maybe, I mean, so I was kind of very lucky, because I think when I was as an undergrad, I think we read a lot of working papers that turned out to be influential. I don't think it was by chance. It was that my classmate. So I took 5 years, but I took 6 years because I was in the army to do my undergrad. But Federico Sturzenegger was a classmate of mine, took only 3 years, because that's the type of person he is. And he was already at MIT, and he was sending to like small university that we both went to, kind of like working papers, like important working papers. And his dad, that's also a very good trained economist. He went to Harvard, I believe. He was teaching that. So I was like so lucky of seeing many papers that later on came out. Right. I mean, it was, you know, I mean, I went to this small university in the middle of nowhere, and, you know, have this access. It was really like, you know, like a blessing.
Great. Well, excellent, Fernando. It's really nice to talk to you. And the last question I want to ask you is if there is anything else you want to talk about the work or the life of Robert Lucas that I have not asked you.
Yeah, I guess one thing I would say that as a personal level, Bob was a very generous person. So he was incredibly generous with his colleagues, with his ideas, with his time. You know, I started in Chicago as an assistant professor, so I know this, you know, sort of from, you know, being treated as an equal, you know, sort of, you know, kind of giving you respect for your ideas, and, you know, sort of like it was kind of like you know, it was really great to be his colleague. You know, you learn a lot. He was very curious. He was very respectful for that. But at the same time, I mean, he did have like also, you know, very little tolerance for what he will perceive as being kind of shallow or, you know, sort of. But he was really a great person. And to tell you the truth, we were also very good friends. So, but I don't think that the friendship really changed, or I think that's my views of his contributions, because these are a bit beyond that. But anyway, so it's a bit bittersweet. You know, he was very weak in his last time, but it was it's really a great loss for us, and also, you know, for the department, and also for his friends.
Okay, Fernando, thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and stay in touch.
Yeah, and I hope that your listeners will tolerate our English.
Yeah. Bye.